Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining this session. Great to see you all here. Thanks for joining the conference. We had a fantastic sign-up rate. So let us know where you're joining from in the chat box. We've had people from far afield. So let us know in the chat box where you're from. It's really interesting to see where people are joining us from. I'll do, just to say, my name's Tom. I work at English UK, putting this event on. And really, yeah, we're so pleased with it. Thanks for coming along. I just have to do a bit of housekeeping and then I'll hand over to Joe for the presentation. So just to say, firstly, as you can see on my screen, this event couldn't happen without the very, very kind and valued support of our sponsors. So thanks so much to Ensley Insurance, Cambridge Assessment English, Macmillan Education, Language Cert, and Trinity College London. Their support's a really important part of how we put this event on. So thanks very much to all of those. Just to say, if the worst should happen and the session drops out for some reason, give us a minute. We will restart the session on the same link. So give us a minute to get things set back up and then just join back with the same link. It's happened only once at a previous event, and within 90 seconds, everything was back up and running. So don't worry about that. Joe will be taking some questions. So if you do have a question during the presentation, please pop it in the Q&A box. We will keep an eye on that. And then at the end of the session, I'll come back on and we'll run through those questions for you. So there we go. So remember, questions in the Q&A box, please. Other chat and stuff in the chat box. Now, so it gives me great pleasure to stop waffling, which I'm sure is a great pleasure for everyone, and say, Joe, thanks so much for joining us. And thanks so much to Macmillan for supporting this talk, a really important talk, of course, on Earth Day. So I'm going to disappear. Have a great session and I'll see you soon.
Thanks very much, Tom. Thanks for the introduction. And yeah, we'll see you in the end. Cheers. So hi, everyone. See, we've got 95 people here. So that's quite a good turnout, I think, for a lovely sunny day, or at least it's sunny here. So today I'm going to be talking about paperless teaching. A little bit of background. My name's Joe Crusoe. I'm the Director of Studies at Wimbledon School of English in sunny southwest London. I've been working here for about 7 years now, and I've been the Director of Studies for the last about 2 years, which is a great privilege for me. So without further ado, let's crack on. Okay, and I'm doing this in association with Macmillan, so thank you very much to Macmillan as well, and to Steve and Emergent for all their support. So we're talking about paperless teaching. It's Earth Day. It's, the environment is big news and something we all need to be concerned about, but actually it's not just about the environment. There's a lot more to paperless teaching, photocopy free, whatever you want to call it, which is, there's more reasons to do it than just the environment. And for some reason, I can't, there we go. There's always an issue, right? So yeah, we all know we need to stop using paper. We all know that the world is burning and we're doing nothing about it. It's very depressing, very sad statistics. In my notes for this talk, my first note is depressing images of forest deforestation and sad Greta, which is pretty much what we've got. And sometimes it can feel a bit like a lot of pressure to do the right thing. That, oh my God, we've got to do the right thing to save the world. But sometimes that's not enough of a motivation, perhaps. And so I thought we'd look at some other reasons. Why is this not? Okay. So two things can be true. Just because it's good for the environment doesn't mean it isn't good for other reasons. There are many other reasons why we should consider teaching without paper, or certainly with less paper than we do at the moment, or than we did. So this talk's going to highlight other reasons to go paperless, and also, because it's always quite important, I think, to have practical tips with stuff like that. I'm going to give you 10 different ways that you can do that. Some of them are quite specific, some of them are a bit more general, some probably fairly obvious, and some hopefully will be new and interesting for you. So if you come away with like 2 or 3 new ideas, I think that's a win. I've done similar talks to this quite often in my career. We've done photocopy free days as part of our kind of green initiatives and things like that. But of course, now we find ourselves in quite different circumstances and with different factors to take into account. So hopefully with this talk, I'm going to be addressing some of those factors as well. So we'll be looking also at the kind of online digital aspect of teaching, as well as just kind of perhaps slightly more basic paperless teaching, basic being the wrong word there perhaps. Because I think, you never really know what's going to happen. A year ago, just over a year ago, the world changed for all of us, especially for those of us who are teaching or working in education. We had to suddenly go online. And I think if you're prepared, perhaps things are a little bit easier. So this isn't a new thing. The world throwing challenges at us is not a new thing. You never really know what's around the corner. You never really know what you're going to have to suddenly deal with. So this was a real situation 10 years ago. I can't actually believe it's 10 years ago now. And this was an email to a colleague in 2011, where a school in New Zealand suddenly found themselves with no materials and in fact no ability to go online or use the internet or anything. So they needed very quick ideas about how to teach without any materials. To give you another example, a colleague of mine used to work in Tanzania, in a small school in a village in Tanzania, and her classroom was a mango tree, and her interactive whiteboard was the mango tree. Her walls where she could put posters were the mango tree. So she had no facilities to use anything other than herself and the students. Those are her resources. So it behooves us to be resilient and resourceful and adaptable, and to be able to use lots of different types of materials, or use materials in different ways. So without further ado, let's crack on. Reason one, the world is changing. It's not a papered world anymore. We don't read newspapers on paper. We don't get our bills on paper. We don't write letters on paper. We barely send birthday cards on paper. We hardly use paper in everyday life. Why are we drowning in it in the classroom? The answer to that, basically, I think personally, is that ELT is essentially quite a backwards industry. You'll probably recognize some of the pictures that I've put up here, if you can see them. I don't know if our faces are in the way. We were using cassette tapes until probably about 5 years ago. I'm not even joking. We got rid of our cassette tapes in the school about 5 years ago. We were using cassette players, overhead transparency. I think that ELT is amazing in the way that it adopts tech and uses it, but also kind of backwards in the way that we lag behind a lot of other industries. And I think we need to update a little bit in that area. But also we need to prepare students for the real world. Part of our remit these days is not just to teach English, it's to teach soft skills, 21st century skills, academic skills, call it what you will. And as part of that, we should be preparing students for the digital world. We assume that they're used to it. We assume that students are fully digitally literate. It's very difficult to say, digitally literate. But actually they're not. They're used to devices. They're used to press the button and you get an answer. But they're not really used to manipulating digital resources, digital media, that kind of thing. So I think it is part of our remit to do that. So that's way number one. Reason number one. Reason two, and for me quite a pressing reason, it's inconvenient. Oh my goodness, the number of photocopies and handouts that you carry around. Students regularly, I mean, one of the most common issues in feedback I've found in my career is students complaining about too many handouts, or just using a book and not having any kind of other type of activity or interaction. Now, obviously just teaching from the book, that's pedagogically not really sound. You need to integrate other activities, and that's the teacher's responsibility. But also one of the main things they complained about was the fact of just having too much paper. Their bags would be full of odd bits of handouts and this handout and that handout. And related to that, it's messy. It doesn't look professional to have piles of paper everywhere, and it doesn't feel professional to have piles of paper everywhere. How many times have you looked for a handout or a lesson plan in a pile of paper in your locker, in your files at home, and you can't find it? Or you're desperately looking for a resource book in a crowded staff room and you can't find it. Oh, what do I do now? Or how many times have you asked students to bring a handout from a previous lesson, or to bring their course book to a lesson, and they forget? And then you have to make a copy, they have to share with someone else. It's always a little bit of a hassle. So If we're not using the paper, those issues don't happen. We'll look at different ways to get around that later. So those are the kind of practical, maybe let's say, reasons, but then we've also got pedagogical reasons. And one of the big ones is heads-up learning. If the students are looking at a paper on the desk or their course book, their heads are down, they're focused in their little world. If their heads are up and they're focusing on the teacher, or they're focusing on the board, or on each other possibly, but particularly we're looking here at focusing on the teacher or the board, it has two main effects. It encourages closer attention from the learners. They can't just read what's next, they have to listen, they have to pay attention. So it encourages the learners to focus a little bit more on the lesson. And that's really important. How often do you find in a class that, you're giving instructions or they're in the middle of something, and you notice one person who's there on their phone, or they're just kind of flicking through the book because they feel like they don't need to bother. But if they have to pay attention to you, to know what's going on, then generally, not always of course, but generally they will. And the second reason it's important for heads-up learning is that you as the teacher have more control over the pace of the lesson. The student has a worksheet with like 5 exercises on it, and they do the first one, they're a little bit bored, they're not the best student in the world maybe, they just go ahead and do all of them. Teacher finished. How often have you experienced that? Teacher finished. Okay, the point is really to make an effort to do this. No, teacher finished. So I think it's really useful to be able to control the speed of the lesson and to say, okay, we're doing this activity now. Not give any information about the next activity necessarily. So heads-up learning, quite a important aspect of paperless teaching. And related to this, and perhaps the most obvious one, is communication. I mean, it is the point of language, isn't it? If you're communicating using language, it cements the learning of that language, and it also increases students' confidence in using it. We all know that, we're all teachers. The communicative methodology has been around for quite a while now. So we're all aware that communication is important, but sometimes we forget to integrate it fully into our lessons. Quite often when I'm observing less experienced teachers perhaps, I'll look at an activity they've done and say, but how could you have made that more communicative? And sometimes we don't consider making as much of our lessons communicative as possible. But we'll be looking at ways to do that again a little bit more. And finally, creativity. I don't know about you, I've been teaching a while. Well, I haven't been teaching for a few years now because I've been managing, but I've been teaching quite a long time. It's easy to get tired, busy, stressed. You've got a lesson coming up, you haven't had enough time to prepare. You just grab a tried and tested lesson plan out of your folder and go. Zero prep, make a few copies, hand them out, done, no problem. But yeah, that works, that's fine. The students get something out of it, but it makes us lazy and it makes us boring, not just to the students, but to ourselves. I found I was starting to bore myself as a teacher. And I realized that, no, you need to kind of shake things up a little bit. And this is one way to do it. There's lots of ways, obviously, to be more creative, to encourage more creativity. But this is one of the ways to think about how to take lessons off the page and put them into the ether, perhaps. So I often find myself feeling like that dog in the corner there with, creating lessons, but actually we can be a bit more fun. We can have a bit more fun with it, I think. So that's the 5 reasons. I think they're pretty good reasons. Obviously, there's probably other ones. If you can think of any others, please feel free to stick them in the chat. And again, the environment is, of course, important. It is important to think about the environment when we're teaching and in fact, how to minimize our impact. And I think schools are starting to do a little bit more in that area as well. Of course, I'm sure somebody's going to mention this, the counter argument to that is that sending emails or using the internet or using any kind of electronic things is also not great for the environment. Yes, I'm fully aware of that. And some of what we'll talk about will be using electronic things, but some of it won't be. Some of it is purely paperless. You could do it in a classroom without any materials whatsoever. So let's move on to looking at some of the ways in which we can go paperless. And the first one I think is emergent language, or if you like, the dogma methodology, where you don't need any materials. this is Scott Thornberry, I think, was the first person to really talk about dogma and emergent language methodology, but it's something that we instinctively do as teachers, and we've always done it. It's something that happens naturally in the classroom, but you can make it the focus of the class. So rather than saying, okay, today we're going to do unit 10 of Language Hub or whatever, you can say, okay, today we're going to talk about this topic and use the students' language as the basis of the lesson and the texts, if you like, or the input language that you use to then teach whatever language point you want to teach. Now, I know that people often think of dogma as basically blagging or winging it, and it can be used in that way, but then I think it's not really dogma, it's not really emergent language teaching, that's just winging it. With dogma or emergent language, you need to have a direction for the lesson in mind. You need to think about where you want to go, what language perhaps you want to be teaching. You might be teaching conditionals, you want to teach conditionals, and so you start talking about hypothetical situations. I mean, that's a fairly obvious one. So it's not just, hey, what do you have for dinner? Let's chat. It is leading the lesson, but using what the students produce, not what you give them to use. I'm not going to go into too much detail on each of these methods or ideas, because there's a wealth of information you can find out about them. We can talk about them a little bit more in Q&A if I have a chance, but yeah, I don't want to go into a lot of depth on each of them, so apologies if you'd like a bit more information on them. We can always discuss it later. So emergent language, or the dogma methodology. And the next is text manipulation. I put this in here because we quite often want to use text. We like the idea of reading. Students want to read in class. We want to teach reading skills. You can get fantastic lexis out of reading text, but they are quite paper heavy. So how can you use text without actually using paper? The obvious one, I guess, would be dictation, or particularly, I think, dictogloss, which is kind of, or grammaring, sometimes we call it. So you're reading a text at a fairly normal pace, and the students have to make notes and fill in the grammar or the language. That's fantastic for language awareness, for bottom-up listening, lots of things. Related to that can be note-taking and retelling. So if you read a text, students take notes, and then they have to tell each other what the text was, see how well they can reconstruct it. You can give students a sentence each, either by going and just telling them a sentence, by putting it one little bit of paper, maybe you could use. That's not going to kill the environment. It's going to damage like one leaf, maybe. So you could use paper, a little bit of paper for that. But ideally, you're telling them, or you're perhaps delivering it digitally, maybe, and they have to reconstruct the text by putting their sentences in order. It's quite a fun activity too. The last one is a little bit more of a reading. So the previous ones were perhaps quite listening and language focused. The last one, on the board by paragraph, is a much more reading skills focused idea. I've done this quite a lot with exam students, particularly with OET students. I don't know if any of you have done OET reading, but there's one of the tasks in OET reading where they have to have a paragraph and they have to answer questions on each separate paragraph. And I found actually that when I gave them the full test with all the paragraphs and the questions, they got lost. They didn't really know what they were doing. It was very difficult to do feedback with them. But when I boarded one paragraph and the questions, and we went through in quite a lot of detail, how do you find the answers? Where underlining in the text, keywords, synonyms, all that kind of thing. All those key reading skills, they got it immediately. And the difference between them trying to kind of figure it out on their own and feeling a bit lost with it on the page, and between looking at the board and doing it communally and figuring it out together, was infinite. They got it so much more quickly when I was boarding it rather than doing it on paper. And I found that really interesting, actually, because it's something we don't think about with reading lessons, to do it communally. But yeah, it worked very well. So text manipulation. The next way is a bit more straightforward even. It's just lifting the course book out of the course book onto the board. There are lots of ways you can do this. Yeah, if you think about taking your course book, opening the first page of the unit, and think, okay, how much of this can I get through before the students actually have to open the book? So for example, if I look at this, particularly this is unit 1 of Language Hub Pre-Intermediate, I have a listening task. where they need to complete some definitions, they need to discuss some questions, listen to an interview, and then complete some sentences from the listening. Well, I think you can do all of that without opening the book. You just need to put a few things on the board. So it takes a little bit of extra work for the teacher, either if you've got an IWB preparing in advance, or if you don't, just quickly doing a lot of writing on the board. But the benefit to the students actually is huge, because it's a collective communal activity. So alternatively, if you have the facilities, you can use scans. I'm sure over the last year, people have got very accustomed to scanning bits of books. And there are some fantastic phone apps you can use for scanning. Or you can use ebooks if you have the digital resource parts of the books as well. Ebooks are fantastic for teaching with, because you can show the full page of the book and use that on the screen. Students don't even have to have the book at all. Of course, they should have it, but it's not necessary. If they forget it or if they don't have it, it's still perfectly possible. And kind of related to the first point, board or dictate exercises, you don't have to do it by hand in the book. It can be a communicative activity. You can do it as a quiz, but they have to buzz in the answer. In the days when you can move around classrooms, you could do it as a running up to the board and filling in the answers. So there are so many ways to make the exercises in course books or on worksheets come to life and be more dynamic. And then it's more fun as well. The students enjoy it more, you enjoy it more, the class is more interesting. So out of the course book is often a good idea. Next one is personalization. Well, who doesn't love talking about themselves? I think some of my most successful lessons are where I've basically put it over to the students and they've been the focus of the lesson in a different way to emergent language. Emergent language is using their words, but your ideas, if you see what I mean. And this is more about the students giving the material, giving the ideas. So using photos, student photos, to talk about their friends, their family, places they've been, describing situations, interviewing each other. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Humans of New York blog and book and website, where the writer interviews people in kind of quite a lot of depth, emotional depth. And I got students to do that to each other, and it was fantastic. They didn't look at a piece of paper once. Or doing Q&A in the class, students ask and answer each other's questions. Again, this has a place in a full course. Obviously, you can't use that as the main driver, the main kind of body of a lesson or of a course. But for, the odd lesson here and there, to just take it completely away from the book and completely in the hands of the students. Things like show us your favorite TikTok, stuff like that. Students love it. Anything about them, they can't get enough of it. Sometimes you can't even stop them talking. Okay, so that was student-driven lessons. Now, next one is probably, I would say, to be honest with you, one of the most obvious methods, which is communicative tasks. So it's pretty obvious. When you're talking, when you're communicating, you're not looking at a bit of paper. But how do you start those off? I think one of the key things is, when you're doing a communicative task, is not to have a bit of paper in front of you. Because how often have you noticed when you've given students a task to do and they're doing it like this? They're looking down at their paper, and they might be speaking, but they're kind of looking at the paper and following the instructions. So board the instructions, dictate the instructions. If it's for a role play, for example. Information gap, of course, they have separate bits of information. It might be a half crossword. It might be they've researched 2 different aspects of a topic, something like that. Things like collaborative decision making. I don't know, you've got to take 5 items with you on a camping trip. What do you take? Those type of activities. Where there might be one collective piece of material that they look at together, but they're not sitting all separately looking at a bit of paper. And of course, the old chestnut discussions and debates. Who doesn't love a bit of a discussion in class? But again, it's communicative, it's them using the language, and it's them not looking down at a piece of paper. So it's really good pedagogically. Of course, the problem with discussions is you have to make sure everyone has an equal part. So sometimes a structured debate might work a bit better. So communicative tasks are really helpful. Communication is very important in language learning, obviously, and so is group tasks, not just pairs, but group collaboration. So a little bit more than just having a discussion, actual in-depth collaborative tasks. And again, this could be using online resources. They could be researching a topic and giving a presentation on it, creating a business model. That's always quite a fun one, isn't it? I think we actually used our business class to create a business model for our canteen in the school once. Promoting soft skills, leadership, decision-making, team working, planning, time management, all of those things come naturally out of group collaborative projects. So I think it's really useful in many, many pedagogical ways, not just for paperless teaching or for communication, but actually for a whole host of reasons. Another quite fun thing for students to do, and to put the class back in the hands of the students, is for them to teach language points to each other. So we quite often do this for revision, perhaps in an exam class, for example, where you might give each group of students a different key language point to research, to kind of find out about ways of using, perhaps give some examples, and then they teach that to the other students. And again, it's using digital resources. It might be using books perhaps, but minimal amounts of copying, minimal amounts of paper. And finally, collaborative writing. I'm going to return to this a little bit in my last point, but there are a lot of ways of doing collaborative writing, either online, together on like placemat type activities, which I suppose again is using paper, but it's not making copies, so I'm going to take that. And I think all of these are very beneficial for the students, as well as making the classes a little bit more interesting. Okay. Right. Next one is something which some people like, some people don't like so much. People have mixed opinions on these, but there's kind of tried and tested sort of repetition type exercises, the Callan methodology, if you like. Drilling, something we all do, should do, still do. Even things like memorization challenges, you know, you give them 10 words, you have to remember them, and then quiz them on them afterwards. But learning by repeating. Tongue twisters, I love tongue twisters. I think they're brilliant fun. I like students to create their own tongue twisters, for example, and use them for pronunciation practice, for connected speech, all kinds of things you can practice with tongue twisters. Now, there's been quite a lot of discussion about how you can do pronunciation exercises online. And we found it works quite well if they mute, if the students mute themselves. You know, they know if they're getting it wrong, and then you could listen to them individually. So it is possible still to do drilling, choral drilling and individual drilling online. And students quite enjoy it. You know, it kind of, we feel perhaps as teachers that it's a little bit boring, or it's a little bit kind of silly to sit there doing chants and drilling. But actually the students get a lot out of it. It's very empowering, I think, to practice pronunciation in that way, in a sort of way there's not really pressure, everyone's doing it together. It sounds a bit silly, so it doesn't matter if you sound a bit silly and getting it a bit wrong. So those kind of tried and tested methods still ring true, they still work. It's still beneficial for students to practice repeating and drilling, and you certainly don't need paper for that. By the way, you may have noticed the random pictures on the side of my slides. I think there's nothing worse than really dry slides, and there's nothing worse than slides with tons of text on. So I've tried to put in some slightly random pictures in. They're all from Unsplash, so they're all photocopy free. Okay, so we've looked so far at things you can do purely offline, apart from I mentioned briefly about the lifting the course book with using scans. But apart from that, you can pretty much do all of this without any digital resources at all. I'm going to now talk a little bit about some digital resources. So way 8 is challenging, gamify, quizify everything, make everything a competition. A good way to do that without paper is web quests. It's kind of like a research challenge. So you might put a list of instructions on the board of what they have to do. Go here, find this out, then go here, find this out, etc., etc. They could each have a different research challenge, for example, and they have to feed back what they've learned. You can quizify anything, of course. You can make any type of activity, any type of exercise into a kind of a quiz or a kind of a competition of some sort. And finally, using movement, running dictation, running up to the board to put answers in. Of course, if you're interviewing Chris Farrell's session earlier, talking about the socially distanced and hybrid classes, that may not be such an easy reality for many of us, but there's still a place for movement in class, and there still will be a place for movement in class in the future. At least I hope so. I really pray there is. And so working together in a group or as an individual, but challenging against each other in many different ways is very beneficial. Okay, I've got about 15 minutes left and I've got a few points still, so I think we're doing all right for time. Next one is replicating paper activities. You know, when we first went online, a lot of people were saying, oh, but how am I going to do a half crossword? How am I going to do cut-ups? How am I going to do grabby? How am I going to do all these exercises that I normally do that make my classes fun? So for a lot of teachers, the supplementary exercises that you do with paper are what makes the class fun, or what adds that kind of dynamic aspect to it. But you can do all of those with various digital tools. So one of my colleagues was explaining how he uses the Snippy tool. If you work with Windows, I think Apple has a similar thing. There's a Snippy tool which you can use to just cut any part of the screen and save as a separate picture. So if you have those traditional cut-ups where you have, I don't know, 12 different things and give a card to each student, you can still do that. Just get the Snippy tool, cut to each one, send it. If you're doing it online, you can send it in the chat to an individual student. If you're doing it in class, you can send it by email, for example, or by any on Edmodo to an individual student. We'll come to Edmodo again shortly. So, you know, there are many ways. If you really want to use those traditional paper activities in the, you know, those kind of photocopiable books with the ring-bound ones that we all have a ton of in the staff room, we can still use those if we want to go paperless. We just have to do it differently. Things like jigsaw reading or infogap activities. Again, we can use chat or email to send different parts of the material to different students. And students quite like that. It's easier for them. They prefer to have it on their phone. They're used to reading things on their phone. They're not really used to having paper anymore. So it's not inconvenient for them. You might think, oh, it's going to be a bit inconvenient, but it's not actually for them. They don't get bothered by that kind of thing so much, in my experience. So we're finally getting to the last point, way number 10 of our 10 ways of going paperless. So I'm just going to do point 10, then I'm going to do a little outro, and then hopefully we'll just take some questions. So finally, and this is quite a big one, point 10, digital tools, digital resources, digital materials. There is a wealth of stuff out there, huge amounts, more than you could possibly ever use or imagine. Sometimes a bit too much, actually. It's quite difficult to find exactly what you need, but there are so many wonderful resources out there. Online teaching, which we've been doing now for a year, is paperless teaching by its very nature. We can't hand things out to the students, so we've had to work out very quickly how to go paperless. And as I mentioned before at the beginning of the talk, those teachers who were already practiced in paperless teaching, whether through lots of different supplementary activities or through using digital resources, were far more able and found it far easier to go online than teachers who relied a little bit more on traditional materials. And that's not to speak again, you know, that's perfectly natural. It's what we've been doing for our whole careers, is using paper. It's very difficult to get out of that habit. But for those that were out of it, it was much easier to go online. So some of the digital tools that you can use, the first and most obvious one is ebooks. Thankfully, publishers, and Macmillan notably, actually, they were some of the first ones we started using, were very quick to produce books as ebooks. Whether there was a paper book which came with an ebook component, or whether you could buy just the ebook on its own, there's a huge number of materials available. We've been using, for example, Language Hub from Macmillan, which has fantastic digital resources. So the book you can have it as an ebook, so you can see all the pages online, but also there's a huge number of online digital resources that the teacher can use to supplement them. And, you know, ways of kind of keeping track of the students' progress and things like that. So we have got a lot more, potential to teach using traditional materials, but online and therefore paperless, which is fantastic. And then there are things like Edmodo. ways of communicating with students online without having to see, because we can't chat to them in the break. We can't just have a quick chat after class. Oh, you wanted to ask me about this particular question. So we found Edmodo is a great way of communicating, but also of doing things like setting quizzes, setting homework. You don't need to give the students a handout to complete for homework. You can set them a quiz on Edmodo, for example, even in the classroom. Quizlet and Kahoot, you know, these have been talked about to death. I'm not going to go into them. The same with Padlet. These are all perfectly usable in class as well, in the classroom, as well as with online classes. So they don't have to be purely used in online classes. They're just as usable. Padlet is fantastic to use in the classroom because you can have it on the board and the students can type things. Google Docs, again, wonderful for collaborative writing. You can post a document in Google Docs and all the students collaborate on it. You can send and share documents through Google Docs. So a lot of our teachers have been really rinsing Google Docs for teaching purposes, which is fantastic. So yeah, we've come to the end of the methods and ways, or the reasons and ways rather. I'm just going to kind of round it up a little bit and then start the Q&As. So that's 10 different ways you can do it, but actually we've been doing this all year. We've been doing it online. It was a little bit of a panic at first, but we've all managed to do it. Whether you've been doing classes, individual students, hybrid, I think everyone has had some experience now of not using paper for whatever reason. So we all have practice in paperless teaching. Let's keep doing it. Why don't we keep doing it? When we returned to school, so obviously we all went online in the UK in March. We returned to school at the beginning of August, and we realized that we still had all the COVID restrictions were still in place. We still couldn't really be handing things to students. We couldn't really be using handouts in the same way we did. We couldn't be using registers. Of course, we'd moved to e-registers previously anyway. So we maintained the no paper rule, the no photocopy rule. And you know what? It works. We use digital records of work and weekly plans on SharePoint. We have digital communication with students using Edmodo, emailing homework, using ebooks. It works. Students are perfectly happy with it. Once you've got into their practice, it's very easy to do. So this just has to be a slight sea change in our approach to paper, our attitude to paper. I thought I could never live without my paper files and all my bits of paper that told me where everyone was and what everyone was doing. But you know what? I haven't missed it. I just got used to not using it. So let's take this opportunity to update our practice from the 19th century up to the 21st century in the industry. And maybe we can even help to save the world at the same time. So thank you very much for listening. That's the end of my talk. I'm hoping Tom is around. Yes, there he is.
I am around, Joe. Thanks so much. Such a great talk. So many ideas and things to follow up on, and people are so engaged in the chat, which is absolutely great to see. And I'm pleased to say that again, we've got fantastic reach. People joining us from all over the world. We've got people from Bangladesh, Italy, Portugal, Samarkand on the Silk Road, of course.
Wow.
And even as far as afield as and exotic as Preston in the UK, which, as we all know, was the first town outside London to be lit by coal gas. So just showing there that we can update our technology, as you've been talking about. Anyway, that's my Alan Partridge skit for the day. Let's get on to some questions. So we've got a few really interesting questions for you, Joe, and we've got about 5 minutes, so we can crash through those.
Hit me. Hopefully I can answer them.
All right, yeah, there's a great one that I remember from my TEFLing days, which was always something I struggled with, and it's about differentiation. So how we help students in those mixed ability classes. So you mentioned a few things about differentiating things. Are there any things particularly about going paperless that you can help? Like often we tend to sort of rely on, you know, having a set of questions on paper that get slightly more difficult with, you know, in a progression. How can we do that in a paperless environment?
I think one of the key things for differentiation, making it not too obvious for the students, is having slightly more open-ended questions. So where they give as much as they can, their output is to the level they're able to give. So if you're asking, I don't know, for example, let's say we're talking about conditionals in the brain for some reason. Let's say we're doing examples of the second or third conditional. You can ask a question where the student can either reply in a very simple, just using the most basic form that they can, and that's their biggest challenge, or with a high level student that could respond with a mixed conditional or a kind of a complex third conditional. So I think the more open questions are,
right,
the easier it is for them to be differentiated without it being too much of an effort for either the teacher or the student.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Because interesting, we've got another question which I think kind of is a follow-up to that answer, which is, in your experience at Wimbledon, as you've gone paperless and had your sort of photocopier 3 days, what have you found in your team to be the main limitations?
I think,
or are there limitations, I should say, I suppose?
I would say, to be honest, no. The limitations are how you kind of feel comfortable with it. So I guess, for example, me, I'm not the most techie teacher in the world. I have to say, I don't use Padlet really that much, or Kahoot. Don't tell anyone, because for me, it's a bit clunky. So that's my limitation. But I think in terms of the potential, there aren't really. In my experience, probably the biggest resistance came from teachers on exam classes. Right. Because they wanted to do, for example, how can I do a mock test if I'm not using paper? Well, the answer to that, which we have, is we have some mock tests laminated. So students can use them, they write the answers in their notebook or whatever, but the actual test itself is a reusable resource. So I think there are lots of ways to make traditional resources more reusable.
Right. Okay, great. Thank you. Interestingly, you picked up, and I empathize fully on a sort of, I sense a fear or distrust of technology, as English UK's IT support would back me up saying that. I think the amount that I call them. But so as one kind of, I wouldn't call myself a technophobe, but I'm of an age, I suppose. I don't change that much. And we do have a question. So perhaps you got something from Wimbledon that can help us here. The question is it the role of the IT section or IT teachers to prepare students for this sort of digital world rather than the English language teachers? Now, I'm going to just preface that by saying, of course, education is a big world. State schools, for example, or some schools will have very different resources and very different departments working, which might not be available to Wimbledon. But so how have you found that sort of, is it someone else's job to get them ready on the IT or get them using the IT? And do the teachers, how can teachers help students, or how can they help themselves to get into that environment?
I think that's a really interesting question, actually, and that kind of speaks to a wider debate in the industry about what is our remit. I think, like I said earlier, two things can be true. The IT teachers can teach them, but also if it benefits us for the students to be better able to do things, then it behoves us to also teach them those things. So I think the answer is it's everyone's job to help prepare students for the world that they are going to enter. Now, of course, we deal with all different ages of students. We have students who are kind of like 11 years old. We have students who are 80 years old. So it depends on, obviously, the cohort you're teaching. But I think that it is definitely all teachers' remit to teach whatever the students need. So there's a big debate, for example, I mentioned 21st century or soft skills. And this is something which there's a huge debate about how much do we integrate it into our teaching. And there's an argument which says we're English teachers, we just teach them the language, it's their business, it's their parents' job to teach them everything else. Right. But actually, what kind of students do we want to come out of our lessons? Do we want someone to come out of our lessons knowing how to use the third conditional, but having no clue about how to send an email? Or, do you know what I mean? Like, I think that's kind of our responsibility as well. So there's a lot more debate on that, I would say.
Absolutely, thank you. And someone's pointed out, think of all the lovely real English being used as you try and explain the tech and new ways of doing things, which is the heart of what we try and do, really, isn't it? Help people function. So absolutely, thanks for the answer. Just a couple more. I appreciate we're going to run over by about a minute, so really quick. Someone has asked, can you give some explanation or some idea of creative writing tasks to keep our learners more activated and engaged in Paperless?
Interesting. I mean, the one which just springs to mind immediately is one I mentioned earlier, which was the Humans of New York activity. Right. I don't know if any of you've heard of that blog, you know. So basically it's very sort of in-depth interviews about quite serious topics, quite emotionally significant topics. And so it's not just, oh, what's your favorite food? Where do you like to go for holiday? But more like, what's the most significant thing that's happened in your life? Or, you know, what are your dreams and aspirations? That kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's collaborative, but also the students have to use quite creative language to express the ideas of their interviewee. So that's quite a nice it's quite a creative in the sense of using language, not creative in the sense of having ideas so much. But writing poetry is a lovely creative language task. If you
Excellent.
some examples and then some sort of frameworks and things like that, it's quite fun.
Perfect. Lovely. Thank you.
Someone put haiku. Haikus are great.
Oh, yes, of course. We love a haiku. We love a haiku. Okay. Last one. So 30 seconds because we've got to end. And I've saved the biggest one. So this is going to be a sort of future of ELT. But in the pandemic, you know, I think we had reasonable class sizes. Pandemic's kind of shrunk that a bit. But is there anything in this change to paperless about the class size or number of students or how you've organized those classes that you found that you'd say? Or is it the same as it ever was, just a different channel?
I think it's the same as it ever was, to be honest.
Right.
We've had classes of 2 students and classes of 15 students. I don't think paperless affects that. I mean, obviously there are things about the dynamic of a small class which are different to the dynamic of a big class, but I don't think necessarily that being online or paperless teaching has a massive effect one way or another, I would say.
Excellent. Thank you. Perfect.
Do what we do.
Perfect answer. Gold star for the time as well. Cheers. All right. Excellent. Okay. We've got to bring it to a close because we have to go and get ready for our plenary session coming up. Very exciting. Sylvana Richardson and Chia Swang Chong talking about non-native English speaker teachers. So I'm sure I can say on behalf of everyone in the room, Joe, thanks so much for such a fantastic presentation. So clear. So many helpful ideas, hints and tips. Thanks so much. And thanks to Macmillan for supporting that. Really appreciate you coming along.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. Thanks to everyone at English UK. Thanks to everyone at Macmillan who was very supportive, and to everyone who attended. I really appreciate all your lovely comments. Thank you so much.
Lovely. And thanks very much to everyone for joining. So we're going to go and get the plenary session ready. So we very much hope to see you there and hope to see you this afternoon for more sessions. Thanks so much, and we'll see you soon.